I never thought a simple afternoon in my backyard could turn into the kind of nightmare that changes your life. One minute, I was laughing, running around with my younger brother, and the next, my shoulder felt like it had been ripped from my body. My dad brushed it off with a chuckle, calling it kids being rough. But the orthopedist didn't even try to hide his shock. That moment would mark the beginning of a journey I never expected. One that would test my courage, reveal hidden truths about family, and show me how far I'd have to go to protect myself. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Emma Collins. I was 15 at the time, and I grew up in a quiet suburban town in Colorado Springs. Life seemed normal on the surface. My younger brother, Tyler, was 11, full of energy and mischief, the kind of kid who could make you laugh 1 second and scream the next. My dad, Mark, worked long hours as an accountant and often relied on humor to diffuse tension or avoid deeper conversations. My mom, Diane, was a nurse, which meant she had a strong instinct for health matters, but was often exhausted from long shifts at the hospital. Growing up, our house was filled with the usual chaos of a family with kids, weekend soccer games, and the constant hum of everyday life. But none of us were prepared for the afternoon that would change everything. It all started on a bright Saturday morning. The sun was shining, birds were chirping, and Tyler and I decided to turn our backyard into our own little adventure playground. We had a makeshift obstacle course set up with hula hoops, cones, and jump ropes, pretending we were explorers navigating a treacherous jungle. I was always the more careful one, meticulously planning each mission, while Tyler was impulsive, throwing caution to the wind. On this particular day, I remember laughing as he tackled me from behind, knocking me off balance as we competed in a mock wrestling match. I didn't think much of it at first. Roughhousing was normal for us, and Tyler rarely meant any real harm. But when I tried to get up, the sharp, burning pain in my right shoulder made me freeze in place. It was like someone had twisted it completely out of alignment. I gasped and clutched my arm, my face turning pale as the pain radiated down my arm. Tyler immediately jumped back, eyes wide. "Emma, are you okay?" he asked, his usual smirk replaced with genuine concern. I shook my head, barely able to speak, tears stinging my eyes. My dad, who had just come out of the garage holding a cup of coffee, laughed and waved his hand. Kids play rough, Emma. You'll be fine," he said casually, clearly thinking this was just another minor scrape or bruise. But my mother, hearing the commotion from inside, rushed out, her expression instantly shifting from curiosity to alarm when she saw me holding my arm unnaturally. "Emma, that doesn't look right," she said, her nurse instincts kicking in. Despite the pain, my dad insisted it was nothing serious. "You're overreacting," he said, chuckling nervously. "Tyler's just a kid. He didn't mean anything." But my mother didn't look convinced. She knelt beside me, gently trying to move my arm, but I couldn't even lift it without wincing in agony. She could see right away that something was off, but my dad continued to dismiss it, brushing her concern aside. "It's probably just a sprain," he said again, clearly uncomfortable with the idea of a real medical issue. I felt a growing frustration and fear, a mix of the sharp pain and the helplessness of not being taken seriously. Eventually, my mom took charge. She said, "We need to get her checked immediately," ignoring my dad's protests. Tyler hovered beside me, guilt written all over his face. I said, "I didn't mean to, Emma," he said, his usual bravado completely gone. I could barely respond, both from the pain and from the confusion of why my dad wasn't taking this seriously. We quickly gathered ourselves and drove to the local urgent care clinic, my arm awkwardly pinned against my side. The entire car ride was silent except for my shallow breaths and Tyler's occasional apologies. At the clinic, the nurse who first attended me looked concerned as she guided me to her room. She asked me to describe what had happened, and I explained it as best I could through the pain. Tyler sat on the edge of the chair, fiddling with his hands, and my dad hovered in the doorway, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. The nurse immediately called in the orthopedist, Dr. Paul Simmons, who had a reputation for being both professional and blunt. Within seconds of examining my shoulder, his eyes widened slightly. "This isn't a minor injury," he said. It's a full dislocation. This could have caused nerve damage if left untreated. You need immediate treatment. For the first time that day, my dad's face paled. The humor and dismissive attitude vanished, replaced with a nervous tension that made the air feel heavy. Tyler looked like he wanted to shrink into the floor, and I felt a mix of relief and anxiety. Relief that someone finally took me seriously, and anxiety over the fact that my injury was far worse than any of us imagined. I had expected the usual laugh and a bandage, but instead I was facing a real medical emergency that no one could downplay. Even as Dr. Simmons explained the procedure to pop my shoulder back into place and the importance of follow-up care, I couldn't shake the thought of how differently things might have turned out if my mother hadn't insisted we come in. My dad's laughter earlier, Tyler's accidental roughness, and my own hesitation to speak up could have had lasting consequences. That moment in the clinic, surrounded by professionals who treated the injury seriously, was the first time I realized how crucial it is to trust your instincts and to seek help when something feels wrong, even if others dismiss it. Little did I know, this was just the beginning of a journey that would uncover deeper truths about responsibility, courage, and standing up for yourself. The days after the dislocation were some of the most frustrating and eye-opening of my life. At home, the house that usually felt like a safe and familiar place had shifted into something tense and uncertain. My arm was in a sling, immobile, and every small movement reminded me of that sharp, burning pain. What made it worse wasn't just the physical discomfort, it was the subtle tension that had crept into our family dynamics, a tension I hadn't fully noticed before. My dad seemed to tiptoe around the situation, half apologetic, but still stubbornly refusing to admit that Tyler's rough play had caused a serious injury. He would mutter phrases like, "Kids will be kids," or "It's just a bump in the road," as if repeating it enough would make the truth less real. I couldn't help but notice how differently my mom approached it. She was careful, methodical, and never once downplayed what happened. She monitored my healing, reminded Tyler to be more cautious, and quietly made notes about what had happened that day. There was a stark contrast between her seriousness and my dad's almost cavalier attitude, and it made me start paying closer attention to the ways our family handled conflict and responsibility. Even Tyler, who had been so innocent in his mischief that morning, started to show signs of guilt. He would linger near me while I struggled to do even simple tasks, offering awkward help or tentative apologies. "I didn't mean to hurt you, Emma," he would whisper, eyes downcast. At first, I tried to brush it off, not wanting him to feel like a bad kid, but deep down, I couldn't shake the sense that someone had to acknowledge the seriousness of the situation. My dad's constant minimization was making me doubt myself. Was I overreacting? Was I being dramatic? These questions gnawed at me, even as the throbbing in my shoulder reminded me that my pain was very real. School became another layer of stress. Even though my friends were sympathetic, I felt isolated. Simple activities like carrying books or participating in gym class were impossible. The teachers were supportive, but couldn't fully grasp the emotional side of what I was going through. The frustration of being dismissed by a parent, the awkwardness of navigating family tension, and the constant worry about my shoulder. I started paying attention to how people's reactions could shape the way I saw myself. My friends were validating and kind, yet the undercurrent of embarrassment and helplessness made me feel small. I realized that the hidden problem wasn't just Tyler's rough play or my injury. It was the combination of neglect, denial, and the casual dismissal of serious issues by someone I should have been able to trust implicitly. At home, the atmosphere was suffocating. Meals were quiet, punctuated by the occasional awkward joke from my dad or a heavy sigh from my mom. Tyler tried to act cheerful, but I could see the tension behind his smiles. My dad's laughter, once so comforting and familiar, had been replaced by uneasy chuckles that didn't reach his eyes. It was as if the joke had been drained from our home, leaving only an unspoken acknowledgement that something had gone terribly wrong. I began to notice patterns I hadn't before. The way my dad avoided serious conversations, how he deflected responsibility, and how he subtly encouraged Tyler to move past the incident without reflection. It was frustrating because I could feel the weight of truth pressing against the edges of our family dynamic, and no one seemed willing to confront it directly. Physically, my shoulder was healing slowly, but the process was grueling. Every physical therapy session reminded me of the moment of dislocation, the way my arm had been yanked painfully from its socket. I became hyper-aware of my body and its limitations, which only added to my emotional strain. Even small movements caused flashes of panic, lifting a plate, reaching for a doorknob, or helping Tyler with a simple chore. The physical vulnerability mirrored the emotional vulnerability I was experiencing, and it made me more determined to pay attention to the subtle signals of danger or neglect. I realized that injuries weren't just about bones and ligaments. They were about accountability, responsibility, and the way people respond when something serious happens. During this period, I also noticed the first hints of an unspoken hierarchy in our household. My mom, though exhausted and overworked, became the voice of reason and caution, while my dad unconsciously used humor and dismissal as a shield against uncomfortable truths. Tyler, caught in the middle, oscillated between guilt and defiance. I began to document small incidents, writing down when my dad brushed things off, when Tyler repeated rough behavior, and when I felt genuinely unheard. It was a subtle form of evidence gathering, a way of proving to myself that my experience mattered, even if no one else fully acknowledged it. I didn't yet realize that this habit of observation and documentation would become critical later, but the seeds were planted. One evening, my mom sat me down while I struggled to open a jar of peanut butter with my injured arm. "Emma," she said gently, "I know your dad doesn't always see things the way they are, but that doesn't mean you're imagining this. You were hurt, and it matters. You need to trust your instincts." Her words hit me harder than any lecture or reprimand could have. For the first time, I felt validated, even if only in small increments. It was the first moment I realized that the hidden problem wasn't just the dislocation, it was the culture of dismissal and the casual minimization of serious issues that had allowed the incident to escalate. That realization was empowering, but it also filled me with a quiet anxiety about what might come next. As the week progressed, small moments reinforced the reality of the situation. Tyler accidentally bumped into me while grabbing a water bottle, sending a jolt of pain through my shoulder. My dad laughed nervously, as if trying to downplay the severity again, while my mom intervened immediately, her tone firm but calm. These moments revealed the fault lines in our family's behavior, making it clear that the casual kids play rough attitude had no place in real accountability. I began to understand that healing wasn't just physical, it was about confronting truths that had been ignored for too long. And even though I was still in pain, I started preparing myself for the steps I would have to take to make sure my experience was taken seriously, and that the truth of what happened could no longer be dismissed. By the end of that first week, I had a clearer sense of the patterns at play. Tyler was remorseful but still learning, my dad was uncomfortable but unwilling to confront reality directly, and my mom was quietly determined to protect me and ensure accountability. The hidden problem, denial, minimization, and the subtle power dynamics that allowed serious issues to go unchecked was now fully apparent. I could feel that this was just the beginning, and that the journey ahead would demand more courage and persistence than I had ever needed before. By the second week after the dislocation, it became painfully clear that things couldn't continue the way they were. I was still in my sling, struggling to perform even the simplest daily tasks. What had started as a painful inconvenience was quickly spiraling into something much larger. Every interaction in our household now carried a subtle weight. Tyler was more careful around me, but I could sense his unease, a mixture of guilt and frustration at being told repeatedly to be gentler.
My dad's attempts at humor had devolved into awkward avoidance, as if ignoring the problem might somehow make it go away. My mom, on the other hand, had become relentless in her insistence that this wasn't a minor incident, that proper care, observation, and acknowledgement of the truth were non negotiable. What none of us anticipated was how quickly the ripple effects of one misjudged moment could expose deeper cracks in the way we functioned as a family. The inciting incident that made it clear that the situation was unsustainable occurred one evening during dinner. Tyler, eager to help and prove he was learning his lesson, reached across the table to pass me a dish. My arm tensed in reflexive pain, the muscles around my shoulders spasming involuntarily. I yelped, causing a cascade of startled reactions around the table. My mom immediately intervened, holding my arm and instructing Tyler to step back. "Emma, it's okay. And Tyler, you need to watch how close you get," she said firmly. My dad, however, sighed and muttered under his breath, "It's just an accident. Don't make a big deal out of it." His dismissal hit me harder than the pain itself. I realized in that moment that the casual minimization I had experienced since the injury was more than frustrating, it was dangerous. If my dad continued to downplay the seriousness of what had happened, I could risk further injury, and Tyler would never learn the weight of responsibility that comes with his actions. The following day, my mother scheduled a follow-up visit with Dr. Simmons, the orthopedist. She had called ahead and explained the situation in detail, emphasizing both the injury and the ongoing tension at home. I remember sitting in the waiting room, the sling pressed awkwardly against my torso, feeling a mixture of nervous anticipation and cautious hope. I had always trusted my mother's judgment, but I wasn't sure how my father would react if she pressed the urgency of the matter too strongly. The reality was settling in. This was no longer just a minor accident. The truth of what had happened needed to be addressed, and no amount of humor or casual dismissal could erase the objective facts. When Dr. Simmons examined my shoulder again, his concern was immediate. "Emma, your healing is progressing, but there's a real risk of recurring dislocation if you're not careful. And the way this injury happened, it wasn't just a simple tumble. You need to make sure everyone at home understands the severity," he said, his eyes locking with mine with a seriousness that left no room for debate. I nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on my chest. He recommended a stricter regimen for physical therapy, detailed exercises to strengthen the shoulder, and most importantly, a structured plan for Tyler and my dad to prevent any further incidents. For the first time, I felt validated in my fear and frustration. Someone with authority and expertise was taking my injury seriously, and that external acknowledgement began to crystallize the truth I had been grappling with at home.
On the drive back, my mom was silent for a few minutes, her eyes focused on the road. Finally, she spoke. "Emma, you need to be careful, but you also need to start asserting yourself. Your dad doesn't always understand what's at stake, and Tyler, he's still learning. But that doesn't mean you should just accept negligence or casual dismissal. You have a right to be heard and protected." Her words resonated deeply, sparking a quiet determination within me. I realized that my injury wasn't just about pain. It was about responsibility, accountability, and the courage to speak up when the people around you refuse to acknowledge a serious problem. That evening, as we returned home, the tension in the air was almost tangible. Tyler lingered near the doorway, watching me carefully as if awaiting my next move. My dad sat in his usual spot on the couch, flipping through the television channels with a distracted expression. I knew that something had to change. The casual laughter, the jokes, and the minimization that had dominated our household since the injury could no longer continue. I needed to establish boundaries, communicate the reality of my situation, and insist on responsibility from both my dad and Tyler. For the first time, I felt the growing sense that the way we had been operating as a family, ignoring serious incidents, deflecting accountability, and avoiding confrontation, was unsustainable and unsafe. Over the next few days, I began to notice patterns that I had overlooked initially. Tyler, while remorseful, still had moments of recklessness, especially when he became distracted or excited. My dad continued to vacillate between awkward humor and irritation, neither fully acknowledging the problem nor allowing it to escalate into a proper conversation. My mom, as always, quietly observed and gently intervened, her patience remarkable but finite. Each interaction became a test of how far I was willing to push for acknowledgement and how determined I was to prevent further harm. The stakes were rising, and the hidden problem, the mixture of negligence, denial, and casual minimization, was now impossible to ignore. By the end of that week, it was evident that our household dynamics had shifted in a way that demanded action. I could no longer rely on my dad's casual dismissal to protect me, or trust that Tyler would automatically learn his lessons from one injury. The truth was clear. If I didn't assert myself, if I didn't insist on accountability, the risks to my safety and well-being would continue. That realization was both terrifying and empowering. It marked a turning point, the moment when I recognized that the old way of handling conflict, pain, and responsibility was no longer sufficient. From that point forward, I knew that the journey ahead would require courage, clarity, and the willingness to confront uncomfortable truths head on. The tension at home didn't go unnoticed, and soon enough, outside eyes began to see the truth that my dad had tried so hard to ignore. It happened first with our school nurse, Mrs. Reynolds, who had always been kind and attentive to students. She noticed me struggling with tasks I had previously handled easily. Carrying my books, opening lockers, even adjusting my backpack caused me discomfort. One afternoon, she stopped me in the hallway as I tried to lift my gym bag with my uninjured arm compensating awkwardly for the sling. "Emma, are you still having trouble with your shoulder?" she asked gently, her brow furrowed in concern. I nodded, embarrassed, expecting her to offer the usual kids play rough platitudes. Instead, she paused, observing me carefully, then said something I hadn't expected. "This sounds serious. Has anyone outside your family checked to make sure it's healing properly?" Her words were like a small lifeline, validating my concerns in a way my dad never had. Mrs. Reynolds encouraged me to ask my parents to provide full details of the injury to the school, particularly for gym class and any physical activities. When I hesitated, my mother spoke up immediately, firmly emphasizing the need for caution and documentation. "Emma's shoulder was fully dislocated. It's healing, but she's at risk of re-injury. She needs modified activities until cleared by her orthopedist." My father shifted uncomfortably in the background, mumbling something about being overcautious, but the nurse didn't miss a beat. She took notes and ensured that Emma's physical limitations were officially recorded, signaling the first time an external party had treated the situation with the seriousness it deserved. It was a small victory, but it marked a turning point. The hidden truth of my injury was now recognized outside the walls of our home. At the same time, my mother began reaching out to professionals for guidance on how to prevent Tyler from causing further harm. She spoke with Dr. Simmons again and asked detailed questions about how injuries like mine could occur and how parents should respond. Dr. Simmons' advice was unequivocal. He confirmed that my injury was serious, emphasized the risk of repeated dislocation, and noted that parental dismissal could contribute to long-term complications. My mom shared this information with my dad, who tried to argue that she was exaggerating, but Dr. Simmons' professional authority made it difficult to ignore. Even Tyler began to understand the gravity of the situation, though his remorse mixed uneasily with the natural restlessness of an 11-year-old.
The most significant moment came a few days later, when my mother arranged a formal review of my physical therapy progress with a specialist from the rehabilitation center. I was nervous, partly because I knew my father would have to confront the severity of the injury in front of professionals, and partly because I wasn't sure how Tyler would react. The session began as routine, with a physical therapist guiding me through strengthening exercises and assessing my range of motion. But as the therapist gently manipulated my arm, my dad's unease became palpable. He shifted in his chair, muttering under his breath about being too dramatic and making a fuss over nothing, only to be reminded by the therapist that my dislocation was not minor.
Every motion of my arm revealed the lingering instability and pain, and for the first time, my dad's dismissive attitude began to crumble under objective evidence. It wasn't just professionals who began to see the truth. My friends, who had visited me at home, noticed how careful I had to be with every movement. They asked questions about my arm, and their concern felt authentic, contrasting sharply with the jokes and laughter my dad had previously used to mask his discomfort with reality. Even casual acquaintances started to pick up on the seriousness of my situation. One neighbor, noticing me struggling with a bag of groceries, commented on my sling and asked if my father had been helping me appropriately. The comment was small, but it reinforced the growing consensus outside the family. The injury was real, the pain was real, and the casual dismissal at home was not acceptable. As the external scrutiny increased, the dynamics inside the household began to shift. My dad could no longer rely on humor or deflection. He found himself confronted repeatedly by professionals, friends, and even school staff. He tried to maintain control of the narrative by downplaying things when alone, but the objective truth was accumulating faster than he could counteract. Each appointment, each conversation, each observation by someone outside the family was a small nail in the coffin of the denial that had dominated our household. Even Tyler, who had previously shrugged off the incident as a minor accident, was forced to reckon with the seriousness of his actions. He began keeping a closer eye on me, helping more cautiously, and listening intently when my mom explained the importance of responsibility and care. Meanwhile, I started to recognize the power of objective evidence. Photographs of my arm, written notes from doctors, school documentation, and records of physical therapy sessions were all quietly accumulating. I realized that these pieces of evidence could serve as proof if I ever needed to assert my experience more forcefully. For the first time, I felt a sense of control over the narrative that had been dominated by my father's dismissive attitude. I understood that truth wasn't just about what I said, it was about what could be verified, documented, and witnessed. That realization gave me a small but significant boost of confidence. By the end of this period, the hidden truth had started to emerge in unmistakable ways. My injury, once minimized as a simple accident, was now recognized by professionals, teachers, friends, and even Tyler himself. My father's casual dismissal had begun to falter in the face of undeniable evidence. The outside world was starting to see what I had known all along. This wasn't minor. This wasn't something to laugh off, and my safety and well-being deserved to be taken seriously. The stage was now set for the next phase of the journey, gathering evidence, building the case for accountability, and confronting the denial that had long dominated our household. As the days passed, the tension inside our home grew almost unbearable. What had begun as a painful accident had transformed into a quiet battlefield where the battle lines were drawn between accountability and denial. Tyler, now painfully aware of the consequences of his actions, tried his best to move cautiously, but he was still a child, impulsive and energetic, prone to moments of carelessness. My dad, meanwhile, became increasingly defensive. His attempts to downplay the incident were now met with subtle resistance, both from my mother and from external parties who had begun to recognize the severity of the situation. I, too, felt the growing pressure. Each moment of pain, each limitation imposed by my injured shoulder served as a reminder that something had to change, that the truth of what had happened could no longer be swept aside, and that my voice was going to be necessary to ensure accountability. One afternoon, while trying to carry a laundry basket upstairs, I winced sharply and dropped the clothes halfway. Tyler had been following behind me, attempting to help, but he accidentally bumped my sling. The pain shot through my shoulder like an electric jolt. I gasped and froze, tears threatening to spill, and that was the moment I realized I could no longer rely solely on warnings or hope that Tyler would instinctively understand the seriousness of my condition. My mom rushed in, immediately assessing the situation, while my dad lingered in the doorway, sighing in frustration. "I told you to be careful, Emma. It's just a little pain," he muttered, his tone betraying both irritation and disbelief. My mother shot him a look that made him shrink back slightly, but it didn't erase the fact that the conflict was intensifying. I felt trapped in the middle, caught between genuine concern and casual dismissal. The rising opposition wasn't just confined to physical space, it seeped into every conversation, every interaction. My dad began subtly undermining my complaints, often questioning whether my shoulder really hurt or whether I was exaggerating. "You're doing fine, you just need to toughen up," he would say, trying to assert control over the narrative. Meanwhile, Tyler, while genuinely remorseful, started showing signs of frustration, wondering why every move he made could trigger conflict or scrutiny. I recognized the internal conflict within him. He wanted to do better, but he was still learning, still testing boundaries. I, in turn, wrestled with my own emotions: frustration, anger, fear, and a quiet determination to make sure that the truth of what happened was finally recognized and respected. School became an increasingly important refuge. Miss Reynolds, the school nurse, continued to check in on me, and she began keeping a more formal record of my injury and limitations. My friends, aware of the situation, were supportive but curious, often asking for details I wasn't sure I wanted to share. Every interaction with them, every concerned glance or question, served as both validation and a reminder of the stakes. I realized that the rising tension at home was not just about the injury itself, but about power, responsibility, and the refusal of some to acknowledge reality even when it was staring them in the face. During physical therapy sessions, the strain became more apparent. The therapist noted that while my shoulder was gradually regaining strength, the risk of re-injury remained high. Exercises that were meant to be simple now carried emotional weight. Every small movement was a test not just of my muscles, but of my ability to assert boundaries. The therapist, aware of the family dynamics, began encouraging me to communicate openly about pain and limitations, reinforcing that my experience was valid and deserving of respect. These sessions became more than just rehabilitation. They were training grounds for learning how to insist on acknowledgement and care in the face of denial. At home, the rising opposition began to manifest in subtle, almost passive-aggressive ways. My dad would sigh loudly when my mom reminded Tyler to be careful, roll his eyes when I asked for help, or mutter about how everything was being exaggerated. Tyler, caught in the crossfire, vacillated between guilt and defensiveness, unsure how to navigate the conflicting messages. My mom, increasingly frustrated with the lack of cooperation, started keeping careful notes on incidents, documenting when Tyler's impulsivity caused pain and when my dad's dismissiveness interfered with proper care. I observed these moments, recognizing a pattern. The opposition was rising, evidence was accumulating, and the small cracks in denial were starting to widen. One evening, after another minor mishap in the kitchen where Tyler accidentally jostled my arm while reaching for a glass, I felt a surge of emotion I couldn't contain. I spoke up firmly and clearly, telling my dad that his jokes and minimization weren't helping, that Tyler's carelessness had already caused serious injury, and that the situation demanded acknowledgement and action. My dad's face flushed, his mouth opening as if to respond, but no words came out. My mother nodded encouragingly, and even Tyler seemed to understand the gravity of my statement. It was the first time I felt a real sense of agency in the situation, a recognition that my voice had power even in the face of opposition. The week that followed was a tense balancing act. Every interaction carried the potential for conflict. Every small movement of my shoulder became a test of awareness and responsibility. And every conversation revealed the deepening divide between acknowledgement and denial. I realized that the rising opposition was not just external, it existed within myself. In the moments when fear or doubt made me question whether I had the right to insist on respect and safety, I had to reconcile the desire to maintain peace with the need to assert the truth, a challenge that was exhausting but essential. By the end of that phase, the evidence had grown undeniable. My injury was real, the risk of further harm was significant, and my father's minimization could no longer dictate the household's response. Tyler, while still learning, had begun to internalize the seriousness of his actions.
My mother had become the unwavering advocate, documenting and reinforcing boundaries, and I, caught in the center of this rising storm, felt the first stirrings of courage that would propel me into the next stage, gathering proof, confronting denial, and preparing to make the truth impossible to ignore. The rising opposition was no longer abstract. It was tangible, pressing, and necessary for the eventual resolution. The day the undeniable proof emerged began like any other, but it quickly turned into a moment that would forever change the way I viewed the situation. I had been scheduled for a routine follow-up X-ray at Dr. Simmons' clinic, a session that I had approached with a mix of hope and anxiety. My shoulder, still healing but fragile, had been giving me sporadic sharp pains, and I knew the therapist's exercises weren't enough to guarantee full stability. My mother had insisted I be meticulous in following instructions, documenting every moment of discomfort and keeping a detailed record of incidents at home. By now, I had pages of notes, photos of bruises, and records from therapy sessions, but until that moment, it had all been private evidence, meaningful to me and my mother, yet invisible to the world outside our home.
As I sat on the examination table, Dr. Simmons reviewed my charts and then directed the X-ray technician to take a series of images from multiple angles. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as the machine clicked and whirred, each exposure a reminder of the fragility of my shoulder and the seriousness of the injury. Tyler had been allowed to come along, standing quietly beside my mom, both of them understanding the importance of the visit. Even my dad, surprisingly, had accompanied us, though he remained silent, shifting uneasily as if anticipating the revelation he had long avoided. The technician finished, and Dr. Simmons came in to examine the results. His expression was unusually serious, eyes scanning the X-rays with precision, lips pressed together as though he were weighing his words carefully. "Emma," he said finally, his voice calm but firm, "look at this." He turned the monitor so I could see a clear image of my shoulder joint, the dislocation still apparent in certain angles and subtle shifts in alignment that could have long-term consequences if not addressed. There was no mistaking it. The visual evidence was stark, undeniable, and irrefutable. My shoulder had not simply been bruised or sprained, it had been seriously dislocated, and the trauma had left residual instability that could worsen if not properly managed. I stared at the screen, a mix of relief and shock flooding through me. Relief that someone could see the proof so clearly, and shock that the truth I had been asserting all along was now etched in black and white imagery. Dr. Simmons turned to my parents, his tone firm. "Mark, Diane, this is serious. Emma's injury was not minor. It's clear that the incident could have had lasting damage, and the fact that she continues to experience instability confirms that. Moving forward, precautions must be strictly observed. Accidental bumps or roughhousing could be catastrophic." My dad's face turned pale, the humor and casual dismissal of earlier weeks completely absent. He opened his mouth, clearly wanting to argue, but Dr. Simmons didn't give him an opening. "I'm stating facts based on medical evidence. This isn't a judgment, it's a reality that must be respected," the doctor added, leaving no room for debate. Tyler shifted nervously, his hands fidgeting as he absorbed the seriousness of the situation, and I felt a quiet surge of validation. The proof was no longer subjective. It was tangible, indisputable, and supported by professional authority. On the drive home, the atmosphere in the car was thick with tension. My dad sat quietly, staring out the window, while my mother drove with a determined calm, occasionally glancing at me to gauge my mood. Tyler remained silent, his earlier energy subdued, as he processed the visual evidence of the harm he had caused. I realized in that moment that the turning point had arrived. The undeniable proof had shifted the dynamic from debate and denial to recognition and responsibility. The casual, dismissive attitude that had dominated our household could no longer dictate the conversation. My voice, long marginalized, was now backed by concrete evidence that could not be ignored. That evening, the reality of the proof began to ripple through our household. My mother used the x rays as a teaching moment, explaining to Tyler the potential consequences of rough play and the importance of empathy and care. She reinforced the need for structured activities and constant awareness of my limitations. Tyler, usually impatient and quick to deflect blame, listened intently, occasionally asking questions about the mechanics of the shoulder and the severity of the dislocation. I watched him, recognizing that understanding the truth in visual, undeniable terms had a profound effect. He was no longer just told that he had caused harm, he could see it, and the evidence demanded recognition and behavioral change. The next day, I shared the images with Ms. Reynolds at school, who immediately took them seriously. She made official notes to support any accommodations I would need for gym class and physical activities, further reinforcing that the proof extended beyond our household. For the first time, I felt a sense of empowerment that I had never experienced before. The injury, once minimized, was now recognized and validated by multiple authorities. My father, though still quietly resentful of the attention and scrutiny, could no longer argue the severity. The undeniable proof had created a turning point, not just in terms of medical recognition, but in family accountability, reshaping the way responsibilities and safety were understood within our home. Even at home, small victories emerged. Tyler moved more carefully, my mom became an even more determined advocate, and I began to feel the first stirrings of confidence in my ability to assert boundaries. The visual, indisputable evidence had shattered the veil of casual dismissal, and for the first time it seemed that the truth might finally prevail. It was a revelation not just of physical injury, but of emotional clarity, a moment that proved courage, vigilance, and persistence could transform a situation long dominated by neglect into one governed by recognition and responsibility. That day marked the pivotal moment when the hidden truth could no longer be denied and the path towards accountability and justice began in earnest. After the undeniable proof from the x-rays and the reinforcement from both the orthopedist and my school nurse, I realized that the next step rested entirely on my own willingness to assert the truth. The choice to speak, to stop protecting others' egos, to stop letting my father's casual dismissal define the reality of my injury was no longer optional. It was a necessity. I could no longer remain silent or accept minimization, because doing so would not only compromise my healing, but would allow the cycle of neglect and denial to persist, potentially endangering both myself and Tyler. I began preparing mentally for the confrontation that was necessary, recognizing that this was the point of no return. The choice to speak would fundamentally alter the dynamics of our household, and there was no turning back. The first moment came quietly. During a family meeting my mother had called one evening. She insisted that we sit together in the living room, away from distractions, to discuss both my injury and the broader patterns that had emerged in our home. My father slouched in his chair, arms crossed, a faint frown creasing his forehead, as if he already knew this conversation would challenge his sense of control. Tyler sat on the couch beside him, nervous and fidgeting, aware that he had played a part in the situation. I sat upright, my arm still in its sling, clutching a notebook where I had carefully recorded incidents, pain levels, and reminders of the evidence collected over the past weeks. It was my armor and my voice, the tool I would rely on to make sure the truth was no longer ignored. I began by recounting the timeline, explaining in measured but firm terms the sequence of events that led to my dislocation. I described the initial accident, Tyler's rough play, and my father's repeated attempts to minimize the seriousness of the situation. I read aloud from my notes, detailing moments of pain, therapy appointments, and professional evaluations. I showed the photos of my bruised shoulder and even referenced the x-rays, allowing the visual evidence to reinforce my words. My voice shook at first, but as I continued, I felt a steady strength growing within me. Each fact I presented was undeniable, and the cumulative weight of proof made it impossible for anyone in the room to dismiss what I had endured. My father's reaction was immediate and visceral. His face flushed red and his hands clenched into fists. "Emma, "You're making this sound worse than it is," he said, attempting to regain control. But my mother, who had been quietly observing, intervened with authority. "Mark, the evidence is here. The x-rays, the physical therapy records, and Emma's own observations prove that this was not minor. Your casual jokes and dismissals have put her at risk, and it stops now." Tyler's eyes widened as he absorbed the confrontation, realizing that my father's resistance was no longer a shield. I could feel the shift in the room. The point of no return had arrived, and my choice to speak the truth was now actively challenging old patterns. I continued, emphasizing the impact on my daily life. I described the struggles with simple tasks, the pain that lingered even after rest, and the emotional weight of feeling ignored or minimized by someone who should have been my primary protector. "It's not just about the shoulder," I said, my voice firm. "It's about being heard and taken seriously. If this keeps happening, not only could I get hurt again, but Tyler won't understand the consequences of his actions." My words hung in the air, and for the first time, there was silence. Not the awkward kind that signals avoidance, but a charged, tense stillness that demanded acknowledgement. As the conversation progressed, Tyler spoke up. "I didn't mean to hurt you, Emma. I get it now. I'll be more careful, I promise." His voice was tentative but sincere, and it was clear that the undeniable proof and my firm insistence had helped him understand responsibility in a way that warnings alone never could. My mother nodded approvingly, reinforcing the lessons of accountability and empathy. My father, however, remained quiet, struggling to reconcile his long-held belief that rough play was harmless with the overwhelming evidence now presented before him. The tension in his body was evident, a reflection of his internal conflict between ego, denial, and the truth. That night, after the meeting had ended, I reflected on the significance of my choice. Speaking up had not been easy, and it had come with immediate emotional costs. My father's defensiveness, Tyler's anxiety, and the raw vulnerability of recounting my pain. Yet the act of asserting the truth had shifted the household dynamic in subtle but profound ways. My voice, once silenced by minimization, had been amplified by evidence and clarity. My role as a truth-bearer was no longer abstract. It was concrete, recognized by both family members and external authorities. I felt a quiet but growing sense of empowerment, a recognition that truth, when coupled with evidence and courage, was an unstoppable force, capable of transforming relationships, reshaping patterns, and creating accountability in ways that passive acceptance never could. By the end of this period, the point of no return was fully realized. I had chosen to speak, to stop protecting others from confrontation, and to assert the undeniable reality of my experience. The hidden truth, long minimized, was now out in the open, supported by evidence, and recognized by both family and professionals. This choice had set in motion a series of events that would ultimately force accountability, reinforce responsibility, and create the conditions necessary for healing, both physically and emotionally. The journey was far from over, but the decisive step had been taken, and the transformation had begun. The confrontation that followed my decision to speak the truth was inevitable, and it arrived with a force that made the tension in our household nearly unbearable. My father, Mark, had been simmering quietly since the family meeting, his usual humor stripped away by the undeniable evidence and my firm insistence on accountability. That evening, as we gathered in the living room after dinner, the weight of unspoken frustrations and unresolved conflict hung heavy in the air. I had already experienced the relief of speaking up, but I knew that asserting the truth was only the first step. Now came the moment where it would be tested against denial, defensiveness, and resistance. The confrontation with the antagonist. It began subtly, with a question from my father that carried a challenge. "Emma, do you really think this is as serious as you're making it sound? I mean, it's been weeks, and you're still making a big deal about a little accident." His tone was casual, but the underlying tension made it clear this was more than curiosity. It was an attempt to reclaim control of the narrative. I met his gaze directly, refusing to shrink from the conflict. "Dad, it's serious. The x-rays, the therapy reports, everything proves that this wasn't minor. I'm still healing, and rough play could seriously worsen my injury. My words were firm, yet calm, each syllable deliberately measured to prevent escalation while asserting the undeniable truth. My father's face tightened, the muscle in his jaw twitching. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, a visible struggle between instinctive denial and reluctant acknowledgement. "You're making it sound worse than it is. Kids get hurt all the time. Tyler's just being a kid," he argued, attempting to shift blame and minimize responsibility. But my mother, Diane, intervened with sharp clarity, her voice unwavering. "Mark, this isn't about exaggeration. This is about safety, responsibility, and respecting the facts. The x-rays and the therapist's evaluations prove it. Your dismissive attitude has already caused harm. We need to prevent it from happening again." Her tone left no room for argument, highlighting the stakes not only for my recovery, but for the broader accountability of our family dynamics. Tyler, usually timid in these moments, chimed in with a mix of guilt and resolve. He said, "I didn't mean to hurt her. I get that now. I'll be more careful, I promise." His eyes downcast, but voice steady. It was a pivotal moment, seeing him confront his own responsibility, acknowledging the reality of the injury and the consequences of careless actions. I could feel the room shifting, the opposition that had once seemed insurmountable beginning to fracture under the weight of truth, accountability, and visible proof. The tension escalated when my father, in a final attempt to assert control, gestured broadly toward the living room, his frustration palpable. "I don't see why we need all this drama. It's one accident. Emma's overreacting. Tyler feels bad. Let's just move on." But I stood firm, gripping my notebook and recalling every moment of pain, every x-ray image, and every professional assessment. "Dad, it's not drama. It's the reality. Ignoring it won't make it go away. The injuries happened, it's serious, and we have a responsibility to ensure it doesn't happen again. This isn't about feelings, it's about facts." My voice carried a new weight, built not just on words, but on evidence and resolve, and for the first time I could see hesitation in his posture. Over the next hour, the confrontation unfolded with a tense rhythm, alternating between denial, justification, and acknowledgement. My father shifted uncomfortably as my mother presented documented incidents, therapy updates, and professional recommendations. Tyler, emboldened by my clarity and my mother's firm support, reinforced the seriousness of the situation with his own reflections on responsibility and care. Each piece of evidence, each factual recounting of events, chipped away at the narrative of casual dismissal that had dominated our household. The room, once filled with avoidance and tension, now became a place where truth faced denial head-on. At several points, I felt the familiar pang of fear. Fear that my father would refuse to accept the reality, fear that Tyler might regress, fear that my insistence would provoke anger rather than understanding. Yet I continued, drawing strength from the months of accumulated evidence and the validation of professionals outside our home. Every x-ray, every therapy report, every note became a shield, reinforcing that this confrontation was not about winning an argument, but about ensuring safety, accountability, and respect for the truth. By the end of the evening, the confrontation had begun to yield subtle but meaningful results. My father's tone softened slightly, his statements less defensive, though still cautious. Tyler's movements became more deliberate, his awareness of my shoulder and the consequences of rough play more pronounced. My mother remained vigilant, ensuring that acknowledgement translated into concrete action and boundaries. I felt a quiet surge of satisfaction and empowerment, not because the conflict was over, but because the truth was finally being confronted, articulated, and reinforced in ways that could no longer be ignored.
The confrontation left a lasting mark on our household. Small changes became evident immediately. Tyler asked before engaging in potentially risky activities. My father refrained from dismissive comments, and my mother's advocacy continued with a renewed sense of urgency. I realized that confrontation was not about creating conflict for its own sake, but about making the invisible visible, the ignored undeniable, and the careless accountable. The evidence, combined with my courage to speak, had shifted the balance, turning denial into acknowledgement and resistance into tentative cooperation. By the time the evening ended, I recognized a profound lesson. Confrontation, when guided by truth and evidence, could break through even the most entrenched patterns of dismissal and denial. The rising pressure had tested my resolve, my patience, and my ability to articulate my experience, but it had also demonstrated the power of speaking boldly in the face of opposition. The antagonist had been forced to confront reality, and in doing so, the path toward real accountability, responsibility, and protection had been established. The battle was far from over, but the confrontation had created a foundation that could no longer be ignored. The days following the confrontation were far from easy. Instead, they marked the beginning of the dark night of the soul, a period where the emotional and psychological consequences of speaking the truth hit hardest. I quickly realized that asserting reality came with costs that weren't merely emotional, but practical, social, and even relational. At first, I felt a deep sense of vindication. The X-rays, the therapist's reports, and my carefully documented records had forced acknowledgement, and Tyler was beginning to behave more responsibly. Yet the initial relief gave way to a heavy weight as the backlash from my father became undeniable. Mark, who had so long relied on humor and casual dismissal to avoid responsibility, now reacted with a mix of resentment and tension that permeated every corner of our household. It began subtly, with silent treatment during breakfast, the curt responses to even mundane questions, and an air of constant judgment whenever I moved with caution or asked Tyler to be careful. I had expected some discomfort, but the intensity surprised me. Each time I tried to carry a simple item or move from room to room, I felt the scrutiny in his gaze, a quiet but potent form of emotional pressure designed to make me question my own actions and the necessity of asserting boundaries. Tyler, while visibly trying to be careful, became anxious under the weight of my father's tension, occasionally flinching or hesitating when interacting with me. The household atmosphere had shifted from denial to charged awareness, and it was exhausting to navigate every interaction with the constant sense that my father's displeasure hung over me like a cloud. Beyond the immediate tension, the emotional toll was profound. I found myself questioning whether asserting the truth had been the right choice, whether the cost of confrontation, strained familial relationships, moments of guilt, and persistent tension was worth the safety and acknowledgement I had demanded. I felt the weight of responsibility not only for my own well-being, but for maintaining harmony, preventing Tyler from regressing, and managing my father's increasingly volatile reactions. Nights were particularly difficult, filled with replaying arguments, analyzing interactions, and trying to anticipate potential flare-ups. Sleep became restless, filled with anxiety and the nagging doubt that maybe I had pushed too hard, too fast, for too much recognition at once. The backlash was not limited to our home. Socially, I began to feel the ripple effects of my advocacy for truth. At school, while Miss Reynolds and other staff were supportive, I noticed subtle questions and glances from classmates who had previously been indifferent. Some whispered about the drama at home, misinterpreting the necessary vigilance as exaggeration or overreaction. I found myself constantly explaining the situation, justifying my actions, and validating my experience over and over. Each repetition drained energy, but it also reminded me that speaking the truth was rarely easy, and that true accountability often provokes discomfort and misunderstanding before resolution. The physical strain on my shoulder compounded the emotional weight. Despite careful therapy and ongoing precautions, moments of pain reminded me daily that the injury was real and still vulnerable. A minor bump from Tyler during a hurried hallway encounter at home sent a sharp jolt through my arm, and I had to pause, breathing through the pain while managing my frustration. My father, observing this, made a comment about overreacting, and I felt the familiar tension of being questioned even in my vulnerability. Yet,
Despite the pain and emotional turbulence, I knew that remaining silent or compromising on truth would be far costlier in the long run. Every pang in my shoulder became a reminder that accountability was not optional. It was a necessity for safety and integrity. As the backlash continued, I began to experience moments of isolation. Conversations with my father became strained and transactional, with little warmth or ease. Even Tyler, while trying to be careful, seemed distant, as if you were navigating a household that had shifted from playful familiarity to a careful, almost tense coexistence. My mother, while unwavering in support, could not erase the subtle fractures in daily life, the lingering tension, the quiet judgments, and the emotional exhaustion that had settled over the house. I realized that speaking truth in the face of denial created a ripple effect, touching every relationship and testing every bond in ways I had not fully anticipated.
Yet, amidst the isolation and backlash, there were small victories that reminded me why the confrontation had been necessary. Tyler's cautious behavior was genuine. My mother's advocacy ensured boundaries were enforced, and the professionals I relied on validated every precaution I took. I began to understand that the dark night of the soul was not a signal that I had made a mistake, but a natural consequence of challenging long-established patterns of denial and avoidance. It was a test of endurance, patience, and emotional resilience, a period that demanded I remain committed to truth even when the cost was high and the support appeared limited. By the end of this period, I had learned a critical lesson. Speaking the truth, especially in a household resistant to acknowledgement, required courage, persistence, and the willingness to endure immediate discomfort for long-term safety and integrity. The backlash and isolation were temporary, the emotional toll intense, but they were the necessary counterpart to the empowerment and protection that truth ultimately provided. I understood that this lowest point, the accumulation of tension, exhaustion, and doubt, was the final preparation before the eventual vindication and resolution, the moment that would shape my resolve and strengthen my voice for the final push toward justice and accountability. The day of the final push arrived with a mixture of anxiety and resolve, a culmination of weeks of emotional tension, mounting evidence, and unrelenting vigilance. I had realized that my voice alone, while necessary, was insufficient to fully cement accountability in our household. The truth needed to be formally confronted and validated, not just within the walls of our home, but in a context that would leave no room for doubt. My mother had arranged a follow-up appointment with Dr. Simmons, this time requesting a more thorough consultation with Tyler and my father present, so that the severity of the injury, the consequences of rough play, and the necessary precautions could be communicated clearly and professionally. I felt a mixture of nervous anticipation and quiet empowerment. The stage was set for the truth to finally face an official trial. As we entered the clinic, the familiar hum of machines and muted chatter in the waiting room seemed almost ceremonial, as if signaling the importance of the moment. Tyler stayed close to my side, his hand brushing against mine in silent support, while my mother guided my father toward the consultation room with an expression that was firm, unyielding, and unmistakably protective. For the first time, I felt that the confrontation would extend beyond words and personal opinions. It would be witnessed, assessed, and reinforced by a professional whose authority could no longer be dismissed. The atmosphere was charged, a mix of anticipation, fear, and determination, and I knew that the outcome of this encounter could reshape not only my own healing, but the way responsibility was understood in our family moving forward. Dr. Simmons greeted us warmly, but immediately shifted into a serious tone as he reviewed my x-rays, therapy notes, and the records my mother had compiled. Emma's shoulder dislocation was significant, he stated, his eyes moving between my father, Tyler, and me. The injury caused residual instability that could lead to further complications if proper care is not consistently maintained. Any roughhousing, sudden impacts, or careless movements could worsen the injury and potentially require surgical intervention. The words were precise, clinical, and authoritative, and the weight of his professional judgment was unmistakable.
My father's usual deflections faltered under the pressure of medical certainty, while Tyler's eyes widened in recognition of the seriousness he had previously only partially understood. Dr. Simmons continued, systematically presenting the evidence, explaining the biomechanics of the shoulder, and outlining the potential long-term consequences of neglect or repetitive stress. He referred to my therapy notes demonstrating improvements achieved through careful rehabilitation, but emphasizing the persistent vulnerability of the joint. He even referenced literature from professional orthopedics that underscored the dangers of ignoring repeated trauma to a dislocated shoulder. With each piece of evidence, the room seemed to shift. What had been a private struggle, a clash of perspectives and denial, was now a formal confrontation, a trial where facts and truth held unassailable weight. My voice, supported by professional authority, became central, articulating experiences, pain, and limitations that could no longer be ignored or downplayed. My father's resistance persisted, subtle but present. He questioned whether the precautions were overly cautious, whether therapy progress meant the situation was less serious than it appeared. Dr. Simmons, however, responded calmly, reinforcing that caution was medically necessary and that the injury demanded vigilance from all parties involved, particularly Tyler as an active participant in daily routines. Tyler, guided by both my words and the professional validation, began to verbalize his understanding. I understand now. I can't be careless, and I need to respect her limits. Hearing him articulate responsibility so clearly, backed by Dr. Simmons' authority, gave me a profound sense of validation and relief. It was a moment where the truth, long resisted, was no longer a matter of opinion. It had become undeniable, codified in evidence and witnessed by authority figures who could enforce understanding.
The consultation concluded with actionable steps, specific restrictions on activities, a revised therapy schedule, and guidelines for careful interaction between siblings. My mother took detailed notes, ensuring accountability would be maintained beyond the walls of the clinic, while Tyler promised adherence and expressed genuine remorse for his earlier carelessness. My father, though still defensive in moments, displayed a visible shift in attitude, the confrontation with professional authority dismantling some of his habitual dismissal and humor as a shield. For the first time in weeks, I felt that the cumulative evidence, my firm advocacy, and the undeniable validation from an expert had reached a tipping point. Truth was no longer negotiable. Returning home, the atmosphere felt markedly different. Tyler moved with deliberate caution, constantly checking with me before engaging in potentially risky activities. My father, while still adjusting, began to follow Dr. Simmons' recommendations more closely, asking questions rather than dismissing concerns outright. My mother's vigilance, reinforced by the professional confrontation, ensured that boundaries were clearly maintained, and I felt a growing sense of security that had previously been absent. The confrontation with authority had transformed what had been a private struggle into a structured, enforceable understanding of responsibility, accountability, and safety. By the evening, I reflected on the significance of the day. The truth, once hidden and minimized, had been placed on trial and had prevailed. The evidence, the professional validation, and my own courage had combined to create a resolution that could no longer be ignored or dismissed. I felt a deep sense of empowerment, knowing that the steps I had taken, from documenting incidents, advocating for myself, and confronting denial, had culminated in a formal acknowledgement that transformed the dynamics within our family. The final push had been successful. The truth had been heard, validated, and enforced, establishing a foundation for healing, accountability, and long-term responsibility. The days following the final confrontation at Dr. Simmons' clinic marked the beginning of a new equilibrium in our household, a period where truth, accountability, and healing began to take root in ways that had previously seemed impossible. The tension that had hung over every interaction gradually loosened, replaced by an awareness of responsibility and a commitment to boundaries that all family members had now accepted. My shoulder, though still vulnerable, began to feel safer, not just because of therapy exercises, but because the environment around me had changed. Tyler's movements were deliberate, careful, and guided by a growing understanding of the consequences of carelessness. Every small act of consideration he demonstrated became a sign that the message of accountability had truly been absorbed. My father, Mark, remained a complex figure in this new equilibrium.
The confrontation and professional validation had forced him to recognize the seriousness of the situation, and he began making subtle but meaningful changes in behavior. He asked questions about therapy exercises, occasionally checked in on Tyler's adherence to the rules, and, most importantly, refrained from dismissive or humorous remarks that could undermine the seriousness of my injury. While he was not perfect, old habits occasionally resurfaced. There was a clear, undeniable shift in how he approached parenting and safety. For the first time, I felt a sense of stability in his presence, a recognition that while he might resist at moments, he could no longer ignore reality. My mother's role as an advocate continued to be central, but the burden she carried felt lighter. With the professional confirmation of the injury and my father's tentative acceptance of responsibility, she could focus on reinforcing consistency rather than constantly battling denial. She maintained a careful balance of oversight and empowerment, ensuring that Tyler understood the impact of his actions while supporting my recovery. Her guidance became a steadying force, creating a household environment where truth was acknowledged and respected, and where care and caution were not optional, but expected. The dynamic shifted from reactive management of conflict to proactive cultivation of safety and awareness. At school, the changes were equally noticeable. Teachers, already informed and supportive, now treated my situation with concrete guidelines in place rather than tentative concern. Gym class, once a source of anxiety, became manageable because the accommodations were clear, documented, and recognized by staff. I could participate in modified activities without fear of further injury, and the reassurance that my home environment now mirrored this caution reinforced my sense of safety. Even social interactions, which had previously been tinged with whispered judgment from peers, became easier to navigate as I no longer had to constantly justify my boundaries. The professional validation had created a ripple effect, reinforcing accountability and awareness beyond the immediate household. Tyler and I began to rebuild our sibling relationship in the aftermath of these events. There was a new layer of respect between us, one forged from the acknowledgement of harm, responsibility, and the need for careful consideration of each other's well-being. We could play together again, but with structure, rules, and awareness that my shoulder was protected. Tyler's apologies became genuine demonstrations of care, not just words, and each successful interaction reinforced the lesson that accountability and empathy were not just abstract concepts, they were lived realities with tangible consequences. For the first time, I felt that our relationship could evolve without the underlying tension of fear, injury, or minimization.
Emotionally, I experienced a profound shift as well. The months of stress, confrontation, and vigilance had taken a toll, but the successful assertion of truth and the resulting accountability allowed me to feel a sense of empowerment and validation I had never known. I realized that courage was not just about speaking. It was about persistently advocating for oneself, backed by evidence and reinforced by professional authority. I understood that the discomfort, tension, and backlash I had endured were temporary obstacles, necessary to achieve a longer-term equilibrium that prioritized safety, honesty, and mutual respect. This new balance did not erase past difficulties, but it reframed them as lessons that strengthened my ability to navigate challenges with clarity and confidence. Within our household, subtle routines emerged that reinforced this new equilibrium. Tyler would always ask before engaging in physical play. My father would occasionally check in on therapy progress, and my mother maintained detailed notes and reminders that ensured consistency. Every action, while small in isolation, collectively established a household culture that respected limits, acknowledged reality, and reinforced accountability. It was a stark contrast to the previous environment, where denial, humor, and casual dismissal had dominated interactions. The shift was not merely behavioral, it was cultural, embedding a framework of responsibility and respect that could endure beyond any single confrontation. I also noticed a change in myself.
I felt more confident asserting boundaries, more capable of communicating needs clearly, and more aware of the importance of evidence in supporting truth. The experience had strengthened not just my voice, but my resilience, teaching me that challenges, when met with courage and preparation, could lead to transformative outcomes. My shoulder, once a source of vulnerability, became a symbol of perseverance, a reminder that standing firm in the face of denial and resistance could yield safety, accountability, and healing. By the end of this period, I could sense that our family had reached a new equilibrium. The truth had prevailed, boundaries were respected, and the principles of accountability and care had taken root. The immediate tension of confrontation had been replaced by cautious harmony, and while challenges would inevitably arise, the foundation established by evidence, advocacy, and professional validation promised that future conflicts could be managed more effectively. Justice, in the form of recognition, responsibility, and protective action, had been achieved, and the household felt steadier, safer, and more aligned with reality than it had in months. The transformation that followed the resolution became evident not only in the household's atmosphere, but also in the way I carried myself, my sense of confidence, and the broader perspective I gained from the experience. Where fear, frustration, and pain had once dominated my life, there was now a profound sense of empowerment and purpose. My shoulder, once a symbol of vulnerability and helplessness, had healed within the boundaries of careful rehabilitation, and with each day of pain-free movement, it became a reminder of the resilience I had cultivated. But the transformation extended far beyond physical recovery. It reshaped my relationships, my sense of self, and my understanding of courage and advocacy. Tyler and I rebuilt a deeper, more meaningful sibling bond. Play, once cautious and tense, became a balance of fun and responsibility, guided by mutual respect and understanding. He learned the importance of boundaries, of empathy, and of thinking through actions before acting impulsively. Lessons learned not through scolding, but through lived experience and the consequences of the injury. Our arguments, which had previously escalated quickly due to misunderstandings or reckless behavior, became rarer. And when they did occur, we both approached them with a framework of communication and accountability that had been forged through months of challenge. I noticed a sense of pride in his eyes as he carefully considered my needs, a sign that lessons learned under duress had transformed into genuine character development. My father, Mark, also changed in subtle but significant ways. While he maintained his humor and laid-back demeanor, there was now a tempered awareness in his interactions with both me and Tyler. He asked thoughtful questions about my progress, checked on therapy compliance, and even initiated conversations about safety measures in ways he had never done before. I could see that the confrontation, though uncomfortable for him at the time, had instilled a new level of mindfulness and responsibility that extended beyond my injury to a broader approach to parenting. Our relationship grew more respectful and collaborative. The previously unacknowledged tension had given way to a cautious but steady trust, as he had come to recognize the importance of listening, validating experiences, and honoring boundaries. My mother remained a constant anchor, but her role shifted from crisis management to guidance and reinforcement. With professional validation backing the steps we were taking, her advocacy became less reactive and more strategic, creating an environment where accountability was woven into the fabric of daily life rather than imposed sporadically. She modeled problem-solving, emotional resilience, and assertiveness in a way that encouraged both Tyler and I to internalize those behaviors. I realized that her strength, combined with my own growing confidence, had created a support system capable of maintaining balance and fairness without constant intervention.
Beyond my family, the experience reshaped how I approached challenges in school, friendships, and extracurricular activities. I became more confident in advocating for my needs, whether it was requesting accommodations during physical education or speaking up in group projects when fairness and responsibility were at stake.
The months of confronting denial, standing firm in the face of resistance, and validating my own experience with evidence had equipped me with a toolkit of resilience, communication, and strategic thinking that I now applied to all aspects of my life. Where once I might have remained silent, unsure of how to assert myself, I now recognize the value of preparation, clarity, and persistence in achieving meaningful outcomes. Even the household routines that had once felt burdensome became symbols of growth and stability. Tyler's attentiveness, my father's cautious involvement, and my mother's structured guidance created an environment where boundaries were respected naturally, not enforced through fear or conflict. The months of confronting denial, standing firm in the face of resistance, and validating my own experience with evidence had equipped me with a toolkit of resilience, communication, and strategic thinking that I now applied to all aspects of my life. Where once I might have remained silent, unsure of how to assert myself, I now recognize the value of preparation, clarity, and persistence in achieving meaningful outcomes. Perhaps most importantly, I recognize the broader significance of the journey. The experience have taught me that speaking the truth, especially when it challenges denial or entrenched habits, is rarely easy and often comes with emotional and relational costs. Yet it is precisely that courage, combined with preparation and evidence, that leads to transformation. I understood that empowerment does not arise from avoiding conflict or minimizing pain, but from facing reality with honesty, resilience, and determination. My shoulder injury, Tyler's recklessness, and my father's initial dismissiveness became catalysts for a broader lesson that advocacy, accountability, and unwavering commitment to truth can reshape relationships, restore balance, and foster personal growth in ways that ripple far beyond the immediate moment. As weeks turned into months, I began to see my own growth mirrored in others. Tyler's responsibility, my father's mindfulness, and my mother's calm guidance were not just temporary adjustments, they were enduring changes. I carried these lessons forward in all aspects of my life, recognizing the value of courage, evidence-based advocacy, and persistence. I also became acutely aware that my experience could serve as an example for others, that speaking up, even in the face of resistance, can yield meaningful change, safeguard well-being, and create lasting transformation. My journey was no longer just about a shoulder injury. It was about discovering the power of voice, the necessity of truth, and the resilience that emerges when one refuses to compromise on accountability. The final image of this transformation crystallized one quiet evening. Tyler and I were playing a carefully supervised game in the backyard, laughter echoing freely, yet tempered with mindfulness. My shoulder moved confidently, fully healed, yet a permanent reminder of the challenges overcome. My father watched from the porch, a slight smile breaking through his usual reserve, while my mother observed with calm pride. The home, once marked by tension and avoidance, now reflected the cumulative effect of courage, truth, and persistence. A safe, stable, and empowering environment for all of us. I realized that the journey, from injury and dismissal to confrontation, validation, and resolution, had not only healed a physical injury, but had transformed the way we interacted, understood one another, and approached challenges. It was a lesson in courage, resilience, and the enduring power of truth, one that would guide us long after the last therapy session, the final appointment, and the immediate pain had passed. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.